And welcome to our presentation on what are stackable credentials. Today, Jennifer Naughton is joining me as the principal consultant, and I'll be presenting as well as founder and president of Assessment Education and Research Experts. We're doing this within our Applied Lifelong Learning Institute. We'll discuss in a moment. I'm going to have Jen introduce herself at this point.
Thanks, Manny. Hi, I'm Jennifer Naughton. I'm principal consultant. I work with the AIR assistance team and Manny, as well as the principal consultant and founder of Naughton Consulting. And I have about 25 plus years of experience in the industry, and more recently with stackable credentials.
And my name is Manny Straehle. Again, I'm founder and president of Assessment Education and Research Experts, or AIR. My background is in research and evaluation and psychometrics. I did so much of that and liked it so much that I got a PhD in it. And the other thing that you see up there is just in information security. So when I have time, I sort of nerd out on that a little bit. I've been in this business for about 20 years or so. I actually began psychometrics as an undergraduate, inputting and developing clinical psychological scales. And so that was interesting. Assessment Education Research Experts have been around for about 3 years now. We have a huge portfolio of clients in the short time we've been around, and we do a lot of different things, from psychometrics test development to learning solutions to research and evaluation solutions as well, which includes marketing, survey research, interviews, focus groups, and so forth. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, which is all about the Applied Lifelong Learning Institute. This has not been around that long. We've been around probably for about 3 to 6 months now. And our goals for the Learning Institute, or the All Institute, is to be engaging, to be meaningful, to be practical, to be applied, to be problem-based. You'll see that in this presentation, where we use a lot of examples and some experiences and what we've confronted with clients in doing this. One of the other things that I want to direct your attention to is on the right-hand side, you see upcoming courses. We have a course with lessons learned on building a credential with Bill Ellis from the BCP, I believe. And then we have June 1st is translating and localizing your certification program, and that's with Sue Orchard, and so forth. And we have a few more presentations coming up throughout the year, so stay tuned, and we'll have those dates finalized as we continue on putting more courses together. And again, these are all free courses, so you should take advantage of it, and there's going to be other folks presenting besides myself in these courses. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge Liberty Munson, who couldn't be with us at this presentation, but some of her slides are still with us here. She continues to live on these slides, and we appreciate that we're willing to use some of the Microsoft examples. She works part-time with us as a Chief Psychometrics Assessment and Chief Research Officer, and she works at Microsoft as their senior psychometrician there. Today we're going to talk about what are stackable credentials. We're going to talk about the definition, the history, some applications and examples, and we're going to end with the myths here. So there's several definitions. None of these have been formalized. So we sort of created some of these definitions, and on the next slide you'll see a sort of overview definition, a higher level or higher view definition. One definition is as people move up the stack, or they climb to a more requiring more skills, more depth and breadth. That's one way to sort of stack it. Another way is to look at how as they move through the stack, that they're getting more skills and knowledge within the stack. So it's not necessarily they're getting more information in their specific area. They're getting more information across areas. So one definition to look at is it's part of a sequence of credentials that can be accumulated over time. So you're going up in terms of getting more depth and breadth in a certain area, and we'll talk about that. But for instance, you could get more depth and breadth in IT. You could go from 101 to essentially a really specialized area in IT, or you could go across the stack and get sort of more competency in IT areas like IT project management, IT legal, and so forth. So again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is build qualifications that fit within a career path or move into a career ladder to fill the needs of the workforce. So as you look at the stack and why we'll be doing this in terms of stackable credentials and organizing maybe your existing credentialing program in a certain way, it's really to benefit those individuals as credential holders, the employees, the students, to navigate career paths, improve their knowledge and skills in a more logical and explicit way. You're also looking at the employers who might be using the stackable credential in terms of hiring. Well, this person here has IT and they're really advanced in it, but we also need someone who has that legal background and the project management background. So they took an IT course that did cover these things, so they don't have to learn project management and then how to do project management in IT. So that's where the stackable credential can be very useful. And educators can look at how different credentials are aligned in different ways to their own curriculum. So assessment leads to learning in that case. So what is stackable credentials? What is it really? So I think it is a positioning tactic in some ways, and it's a logical positioning tactic in the way you see these cars, these BMW cars organized. Each of these cars have different performance criteria, and they're also designed to meet the needs of a certain segment or audience. So, you know, the 7 Series is probably someone who's more affluent, wants to ride the car in a certain way. Maybe they want more horsepower, maybe they don't. And then you have those sports cars with the Z4 there, which is a whole different model. So, and then you have your utility models and things like that. So there's different needs for different folks, and that's what the credential is too. I mean, when we go from a 2 to a 7 Series, you get more and more power from a credential holder if they were to specialize in something, so they have more breadth and depth perhaps. If you look at a different sort of tactic, this is I think for a online survey system, you could sort of get a very basic system for $0 a month, but it doesn't have all these features. So, you know, when you're hiring someone, they come with all these qualifications that are essentially features. I don't want to objectify the individual, but that's one way to look at it, and that's why this is a positioning tactic. As you go up the stack, whether it's vertical or horizontal, that person's going to have more breadth and depth. Another example is in the IT world, the CompTIA one, and Jen has mentioned that this looks like a subway map, and it does. But if you look at it further, you could say, okay, here's all the fundamental information across these different areas, information security all the way down to software development, and CompTIA has a certification for all of these. And if you were a student or a hiring manager, you could look at this and say, okay, wow, this person has, let's say, the CCIE or the CISM or CISSP, and these are not necessarily all CompTIA certifications, but you could go across the whole stack here, a vertical stack, and go across it, and you get information security as that sort of specialty, and this would be a vertical stack in terms of beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. But you don't necessarily have to, you know, go vertically. You could just get all the fundamentals across these areas: hardware, IT, managed storage, data, web, mobile, and software. So you could be at any point in your career and say, you know, you want to specialize a little bit in information security, but maybe at the beginner area, and then you might want to get further into IT management and strategy and maybe get very advanced, and that's the area that you're being compensated for, and that's where your career passion lies, and so forth. So there's a lot of career mapping that's going on, and IT tends to call this career pathways or certification pathways or roadmaps. So that's what they call it, and that's another way, a synonym really for stackable credentials. So the history really began, from what I gather and from what I researched, is from Ohio State, who are looking to create a stackable credential in a little different way than we're talking about it, to meet these blue-collar jobs like plumbers. So what does a plumber need to know across technical levels and soft skill levels in terms of the stack? And these are more horizontal stacks here, but it goes vertical, then they get more and more specific. It's industry-wide, then it's very close to sector, and then it goes into specific occupational job role requirements. And the stackable credential came from a workforce model rather than a competency-based model. So they looked at what the workforce needs were, and then they worked the stackable credential in that way, and those competencies and those soft skill competencies. And this is the only time we really talk about soft skill competencies, which is very important, and that's a whole different area to focus on in terms of the stack. So this stack should probably always be present when you're hiring someone, obviously. And I don't really know any certification groups at this point that are really sort of trying to create an area for non-cognitive or personality within their stack in the certification world. It's mostly technical competencies. So moving along here, we talked about the vertical stack a little bit earlier, but essentially you would put a certification at the beginner level, intermediate level, or expert if you want to create a stackable credential. If you're starting out new, you could use this model. If you have existing certifications, you might have already, a 101 certification at the very fundamental level, and then you already have an expert one, and you might want to create an intermediate one if you don't have one, or you might have an intermediate one and you're ready to create an expert one. So if you have an existing one, you could organize it this way. Now you have also a horizontal stack. So you have the medical terminology, you have pharmacology and neuroscience, but this is a healthcare professional certification body. And so they have a certification around medical terminology, pharmacology, and neuroscience. And this could be across any of the medical professions where you need to sort of get more information or competencies around this area and offer a credential in this way. Now, if you want to do a mixed stacking or hybrid stacking is what we call it here, is you may have an IT security. So it starts out as beginner, so it's the 101, then you go up to intermediate and expert, and you become a cyber ninja is what they call them in the cybersecurity world. So you work up that way, but let's say you didn't begin in IT security and you were a programmer, and this organization offered C++ as the programming language. So you go up this way, and then you move up this way, and you could do any. So there's different certifications. Each of these boxes here would represent a different level of certification. So you might be, someone in your organization might come as a beginner here, but they want to move up in this stack here. So they might be at this point in their certification world a beginner and an intermediate in C++, and that's fine, and that might meet the needs of that particular job at that point in time and that point in their career. So there's different, when you do a mixed stacking, there's different sort of ways you could mix the stack for your existing program or for a new program that you might have in mind. So I'm going to turn this over to Jen here. So there you go, Jen. Jen, I think you might have to come off of mute.
Thanks, Manny. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about this specifically from an association example, and more specifically from the Association for Talent Development. That is where I used to be a senior director of their credentialing and competencies department for over a decade. And so I'll be speaking about this particular example from that framework and that perspective. So some of the things that Manny mentioned earlier is that associations and other third parties can create these stackable credentialing frameworks from a career pathing perspective, and this is an example of one of those. It's also an example of a stackable credential that addresses that middle tier in the history slide that really talks about moving industry-wide competencies forward. So that is the level or the layer that it targets on that particular historical slide that puts it into perspective of where that gives you a little bit more context. So as far as ATD Stackable Credentialing Framework, it's drawing from an extensive offering in content, resources, courses, and certifications that ATD and ATD Certification Institute have, and it's a cohesive way to package them and position them, as Manny had alluded to earlier. ATD had created a stackable career development framework, and it provides opportunities for talent development professionals who are members in their organizations as well as non-members to grow and prove their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And the approach is very flexible and has a progression that allows practitioners to apply what they've learned to next level development. I'll talk about that unique feature of their framework in a moment. But there are 7 stacks of offerings in the architecture, and they're all aligned to the ATD competency model, which is an industry-wide competency model, and I'll talk about that shortly. So what it does is as far as the spectrum of content and credentials that it covers, it really focuses on ongoing education, and then to the more achievement-focused mastery. So it covers the depth and the breadth of the professional development roles for talent development professionals, and it's designed to serve them throughout their careers. Next slide, please. So I promised you a little bit more of a description about the ATD competency model, and here it is. And what you'll notice to the left, the image, it has your 10 areas of expertise, which are the functional technical areas in the talent development industry. Everything from a coordinator level to a CLO would need to have these to some degree to be competent in their field and in their particular role. On the bottom, you'll see the foundational competencies, and these mirror some of the personal characteristics and personal competencies that individuals need to have regardless of the profession. And foundational competencies will not be the focus of what's being assessed here. We're really specifically referring now to the areas of expertise in terms of the content that is being specifically developed and then validated throughout the stackable educational course offerings as well as assessments. But it fundamentally answers the question, what do people in a profession need to know and do to be successful? And it was developed after thousands of subject matter experts from the field, as well as those that hire them. They contributed to this model. They helped to define the areas. So it was a fairly rigorous multi-month effort, and it was validated with a job analysis survey or practice analysis survey with the industry. So these content areas to the left there, the areas of expertise, those 10 areas really form the core, the crux of what is being taught, learned, and validated as far as skills in the following career path the career path and career development framework that we'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. So here is a graphical representation of the stackable framework. And the important part to know here is that this is from the individual's perspective or the consumer's perspective. So it depicts what their learning and testing journey might look like, as well as the achievements. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Perfect, thanks. So this is breaking it down a little. What you'll notice on the bottom half of your slide are 4 different categories. These are different categories of educational offerings. So this would include everything from ATD webcasts all the way through ATD certificate programs These are delivered in various modalities. Some of them are classroom-based, some of them are on demand or are completely online, and others are hybrid where you have an instructor online as well as self-paced online. And so they vary in terms of the modality. They also vary in terms of the level of content that is being covered, as well as the level of time and investment that the individual needs to make, not only in terms of time, but in terms of financial resources to pay for these areas. So an ATD webcast, for instance, can be an hour long. It can focus on one of those areas of expertise, like within one of those areas of expertise, take instructional designer. That's one of the areas of expertise. Instructional design is an area, and they may focus in on one particular aspect of it, such as building a curriculum. So that might be one area within that area of expertise that an ATD webcast may attempt to cover. So it's a very small amount of content. It's usually an hour, and it's usually something that might be free. By contrast, the ATD certificate program might be longer. It might be a 2 or 3 day classroom-based course where it's more time and more financial resources are needed to in order to take that particular program. So of these particular categories of educational offerings, the ATD certificate program is one that yields a certificate of attendance at the present time. Next slide, please. So now focusing on the top half, these are different types of credentials. There's 3 stacks here. The Master Certificate Series is an assessment-based certificate program, and what that means, it's a course or series of courses, online, classroom-based, and so forth. And then number 2 is there's an assessment at the there's an assessment either throughout or at the end of that learning journey or learning process. And that assessment is very important because it does have a pass or a fail. And those individuals who pass are ones that are individuals who are bestowed or receive the credential, which is a master of something. It's particular based, there's different roles that they can achieve, such as a master instructional designer, master performance consultant, and so forth. But the point being that it's an assessment that those who pass earn the credential, and those who don't would need to try to reattempt the assessment, but they would not receive the credential until they pass the exam that's based on a certain standard. The other 2 stacks, if you will, represented by the orange and the burnt orange, or rather the light orange, and then the red, these are respectively the APTD certification as well as the CPLP certification. The APTD certification focuses on a subset of the areas of expertise and has 1 knowledge exam, whereas the CPLP certification focuses on the broad array, the 10 areas, a full gamut of areas of expertise, and has 2 exams. So what you will notice here is that the APTD is considered, as far as the image and the communication, the graphic is concerned, it's very apropos because it is sort of known as having less content. It has less breadth and less rigor than the more prestigious CPLP, and that's represented with the different podium levels, if you will. So this graphic here is attempting to demonstrate and communicate to the consumer the relative heft and rigor and prestige level of the different credentials. And that becomes very important with respect to how you develop a certification framework. And I will talk about it at greater length in one of the later slides. But I did want you to notice that it's very intentional in terms of the colors, in terms of the platform heights, and so on and so forth. It is meant to show the varying levels of depth and rigor when you look at the credentials on a relative basis. So next slide, please. So CPLP, which is the red, on the red podium, it is considered to be at this time the premier certification for the reasons that I mentioned, but it's also not intended to be the final stop. So in the context of lifelong learning and what membership organizations are very, very well positioned to deliver to the consumers, to their members, to the profession, what they're very well positioned to do is continuously address individuals in the profession, their ongoing professional development needs, and to help them keep pace and with the industry and all the changes that are occurring within the industry and the demands that it places on competencies and ongoing competence. So CPLP is the premier certification and not the final stop. And what that means is individuals are encouraged and to maintain and sometimes that means expand. In other cases, it means just bring their current knowledge base into date with current practice. But the main point being they're incentivized to update their knowledge and skills by revisiting the lower stacks and fueling up on education. And I'll point out that this is the content is integrated from the standpoint, and since it all goes back to the ATD competency model, which defines what you need to know and do to be successful in the field, because it all goes back, all the content offerings, not only the educational offerings, but the certification offerings, they all rely on the ATD competency model to drive the content that's in all of these different offerings, that it's nicely aligned so that an individual that may have a skills gap in one area, they would revisit the educational products that are aligned to the competency model, which would then in turn help them as they may choose to go for another credential on one of the other stacks that actually yields an actual achievement or a certificate, certification, what have you. So it's designed to all go together. It's designed to all go together because all of the content that is embedded in all these, whether it be an educational program or a test or an assessment-based certificate course, it's all designed to go together, tied back to the ATD competency model. And so that is a very key component, especially for those of you that may be designing a system such as this. It's a very key fundamental component is that if you want to have an integrated and aligned set of offerings, tying it back to a competency model and then updating your offerings based on revisions to that model is a really nice, very clean and tight, very best practice way of managing and managing a portfolio such as this. Next slide, please. So this is putting it all together, and this is again looking at it from the consumer's view. This is information that is easily accessible on an online download or by a print document. So in other words, the point being that this serves as marketing and education materials for the consumer. Like I said, whether it be the individual consumer who might be sitting for the educational offerings or the exams, or it could also be given to an individual that may be making decisions for an entire department as to what mix of programs they want their entire department, their learning department, whether it be one department or across the organization, across the enterprise. This is a very effective way to discuss the different offerings and to articulate the differences in just it's a quick glossy. So that alludes to what I'll be talking about later, is when, for those of us that design architecture such as this, or for perhaps you're given that task or you're thinking about doing it, how you articulate it and how you communicate it to your audiences is not a trivial matter. It's very important to be able to articulate it in a way that that individuals can understand it, whether they have a functional background in this area or not, as well as somebody a layperson might be able to understand it. So it needs to be very simple and very, very simply done, and a very clean story that multiple audiences can relate to, regardless of their technical background in stackable credentials or education and so forth. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, but this just gives you an idea of how you pull it all together graphically, trying to show the difference in credentials and trying to give a little bit of a discussion or have a little bit of information, a thimbleful of information on each one, and it can be done very nicely in the graphics such as this. So next slide, please. I wanted to talk about some of the unique features of the ATD Stackable Credentialing Framework, the career development framework, that are pretty exciting, and I think also, for those of us that may design these types of programs, get our appetites a little wet in terms of what things we might be able to do into the future in order to meet the needs of our customers and meet the needs of our employers. Next slide, please. The first way that fast tracking happens within the career development certification framework is that if there's a successful completion of a lower stack, it can apply to the higher stacks through eligibility requirements. So there's a reduction in the eligibility requirement, or rather, looking at it differently, you are able to knock out 1 year of experience if you have qualifying, if you've achieved one of the certificate program prior. So let me be more specific about that. So an example might be a qualifying assessment-based certificate program. If you've achieved that, it's equivalent to 1 year of experience for entry into the APTD or the CPLP certification programs. So in other words, you're able to fast track it or move through the stacks more quickly if eligibility requirement is something that you're looking to. If you need to have eligibility requirements, or you need to be able to meet those eligibility requirements, one way of doing that more quickly is by successfully completing a lower stack that's applicable to the higher stacks. Next slide, please. The second way is a little bit less common, and it is the successful completion, achievement of the testing requirement in one of the lower stacks can help you test out of that same requirement in the higher stack. And what do we mean by this? What we mean by this is a qualifying achievement on one of the assessment-based certificate programs, otherwise known as the Master Series, can allow an individual to test out of that particular area on the APTD and the CPLP. So, for instance, if you're a master instructional designer, that's a particular role in particular role in talent development. If you're a master instructional designer and you've achieved the master, the assessment-based course, certificate course, you've achieved that credential in the Master Series course that's a master instructional designer, it would allow you to test out of the knowledge area, the instructional design knowledge area in the APTD and the instructional design knowledge area in the CPLP exam, on the knowledge exam only. So that's one way that the achievement in a lower stack can help you test out in the specific areas of the certification stacks above it. Next slide, please.
Okay, so go ahead, Jen.
Oh, I was just going to turn it on over to you, Manny. Manny's going to play the role of Liberty.
Yeah, so I'm going to take on Liberty's perspective within Microsoft and just give you an overview of what the Microsoft certification exams look like. They're computer administered. They can occur in a test center, or they can do online or remote proctoring. They almost test about everywhere in the world, and there is no testing window. It's just ongoing all the time. And the type of items that they use, or the question types that they use, range from multiple choice to drag and drop to case studies to code analysis and so forth. So Microsoft has a lot of different things going on in their program. So this is their map or roadway or roadmap or pathway, or what we would call an example of a stackable credential. What they do is they have something called a Microsoft Technology Associate at the very entry level here. So all these are MTAs, and that's the entry level exam, the 101 exam, and this is across different areas from client-based to server-based to productivity, database, and development. So those are the different sort of products that you could do. That would be the horizontal stack. But the MTA all the way to the E, which is your expert, or D, which is your developer, that's the highest in the vertical stack. If you think of that, beginner, intermediate, and so forth. And you become a professional and you become an associate, so a solutions associate, an SA, so you go from MTA to professional to solutions associate all the way to expert in the stack. And you can see that these are different products here as well. In development, there's products under Windows Store Apps, Web Applications, SharePoint, and so forth. If you take client, it's just enterprise device and apps. There's just one area. And then servers, infrastructure, desktop, server infrastructure, and cloud. So there's a lot of different products that it's supporting across the stack as you move up or down or horizontally. There's different sort of areas in terms of expert certifications. We sort of went over that in the last slide there, but just to highlight a few things, there's mobility, there's app builder, there's cloud platform, just to give you a sense that it's across the product itself in Microsoft's world. And IT sometimes does it across the product, like Cisco would with their routers and Microsoft with their products. And then in terms of earning each of these credentials to get to an expert or a developer, you need to earn a Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate and SA, and then you have to add additional exam from a list of electives. Each year you have the opportunity to re-earn the certification by passing an additional exam from a list of electives. So that's how it works within their Stackable framework. And then there's another slide that sort of talks about, well, you need to take an exam, exam 1 and exam 2, and you become a solutions associate, and then you climb the stack again across that product. Let's say it's Microsoft Office or something of that sort. And then if you want to go further, you take an elective exam and you become an expert or developer, but you have to hold the solutions associate. Then if you want to continue to renew it, you're either an expert or developer, and then you take a different elective or you retake an exam, and then you get to renew it. So that's how that stack works. So it's very eclectic. Tends to be a little bit more on using the hybrid model where you go up the stack and then you have a horizontal with the elective exams. There's other examples. A program that I worked on, I think about 2 jobs ago, was with USGBC, GBCI. This is around green building. These are green buildings, and we created certifications for individuals. And across the stack, you have this vertical stack. This is the beginner, this is the intermediate, and this is the creme of the creme, the highest expert individual in green building. So what it began with, I believe their first certification, I wasn't there in the very beginning, but their first certification, I think, was building design and construction, which was the lead AP, and they built horizontally as they built their program across the horizontal stack. So you could go interior design, homes, operations and maintenance. I can't remember ND, I'm sorry. And then what they did is when you go, this is sort of a business an interesting business phenomenon that happens when you go to a lower point or more beginner level. When you go down the stack and create a certification, which is what they did, is you usually get more volume, which leads to more revenue. So, and the Green Associate was a lot more easier to obtain, and it was across different targets. It was really not necessarily, they had unintended consequences in the sense, the positive ones, in the sense that they were able to get lawyers to take this, people who typically would not, like cooks and things like that, a lot more students taking this. And then after these were established, I was really instrumental in creating a lead fellow program, which is more of a portfolio assessment, and it was for identifying the creme of the creme through a peer review, essentially. And that created, when you create more specialized and more expert level, you'll have less volume, less individuals who would end up taking this. So it's an aspirational sort of thing. So when you're here at the Green Associate, maybe one day you're thinking of becoming a lead fellow, so you end up taking this and this and this. And that's not a direct sort of monetary gain when you create those aspirational type of credentials, which fit more in the mission than anything else of your program. Now, in credentialing, we're not the only ones who are doing it. I would argue that higher education's been doing this for many, many years, and they stack it. They have a natural stack in the sense that you start out at 100 or 101 courses, and you work your way up to 999s when you go to your doctorate level studies. So what's new in higher education is that they're trying to stack within career-driven areas. So, you know, you have an EKG technician, patient care technician, phlebotomy, and so forth. And then these things could lead to a health science associate degree and other directory, and then it could lead to a bachelor. So it is stacked vertically and horizontally because you're going into all these different areas of health sciences. So this is what higher education is picking up on, is how can we help the workforce by creating certificate and associate's degrees, different credentials and degrees here. So certificate, there's no certifications here, but you could see that there's an opportunity for them to do other sort of things. You can add a micro credential if you need to, and so forth in this model. There are many, many other examples out there, and a lot of groups don't call them stackable credentials per se. There's you know, the career pathways, the certification pathways, the roadmaps is what other organizations call it. Some organizations don't even call it a stackable credential, but they have a stackable credential. PMI has one, Cisco has them. Learning Tree has been around for many, many years, and that's more on the education side. You could get credentials by just taking several different courses in different IT sectors, whether it's programming or not. I remember when I was very young, maybe 20 years ago, and I was looking at Perl programming, and I looked at the Learning Tree, and they had a whole stackable model, and you can earn a certification from them or some sort of credential if you take 4 or 10 courses. They were one of the early groups in terms of being able to align it with the careers in the workforce very well, in my opinion. So there's different sort of models. Digital Promise has a micro-credential for their skills, and that's around a stackable model as well. These groups don't necessarily explicitly say that they have a stackable credential, but if you look at it, it is a stackable credential because they're positioning from a vertical or a horizontal or a mixed or hybrid model. So I'm going to turn this over to Jen here. So Jen.
All right, thanks, Manny. So as you're seeing these different slides, perhaps one question that comes to you is whether or not a stackable framework is right for you or what the value and the benefits are. One way to look at a stackable framework from a business perspective is that it can very much mirror what people call the sales funnel, where individuals are encouraged to try out a product or to see what it's like before they start investing more time and money into your services or your programs. And so if you think about it that way, offering a webcast that is free, only requires an hour of time or less, and gets an individual associated with or allows them to try out one of your company's products before they move on to successive levels of offerings that require a lot more time and money. That's one way of looking at how a stackable framework can really benefit an organization and really be a win-win for both the consumer and the provider. It allows you to draw in maybe new individuals you haven't seen to your association or your credentialing program, because it lowers the bar of what they need to do in order to try it out. So I think that's just one way of looking at a stackable framework and some of the advantages of it in terms of from a business perspective, and how it can kind of help draw in new individuals you may not have seen before or engage individuals that otherwise may not have decided to take the plunge in a later step. But if you offer them a way to stair step it, it can really be a win-win for both parties, and from many different perspectives. So if some of you are thinking, well, I'm not sure when I should build a stackable credentialing framework, there are a couple responses to that. One is, if you have a portfolio of programs, whether they be educational programs, testing programs, or what have you, that there's a story to be told as far as which programs fit for whom and when, that really lends itself well towards having some kind of a stackable framework where you can tell the story to that individual about what journey they may want to take, in terms of making sure that they're meeting their needs both now and in the future. Another way of also looking at it is, if you have offerings currently, and maybe they aren't a portfolio, maybe they're just singular offerings. One of the big trends, as we've all seen, is micro-credentialing, where you're actually taking existing content in some cases and slicing it and dicing it into smaller units. So there may be a possibility that you have something already, and it may be large or it may be substantive, that you could end up slicing and dicing and then creating smaller units and then having those stack, ultimately leading up to a larger credential. So that's some food for thought. Certainly it's not the one size fits all, as we've talked about. There are a lot of different ways to design it, and it's certainly not for every organization out there if the circumstances aren't right. But hopefully this gives you some food for thought as to whether it's right, how those of you that may have programs that don't appear to, don't have a portfolio, but you're interested in slicing and dicing your content, that might be a great way to work with the current trends, as well as cohesively put things together that it really works for your consumers. So one question is, how do you design and develop these things? We saw so many different examples of ways you could design things. You saw vertical and horizontal. You saw, some that combine education with testing and cover that continuum. Well, I think that there's a lesson in that, and that is, it's not one size fits all. You really have to look at your own program, look at the different roles of the professionals that are engaging in your programs, and then sort of let that be your guide. Let your program attendance patterns and the roles of the profession, the way that the different roles that are in your profession or the different roles that are naturally falling out, let them really inform how you're designing it, what you're calling things, and perhaps which programs you might build first and roll out to the marketplace first. So that's one lesson. Another, and I think perhaps the biggest lesson that I've learned through development of programs, ATD as well as others, is that it's very important to map out the entire framework first. How broad do you want your programs to go? How deep do you want them to go? What type of credentials do you want to offer? Think of it like building a blueprint to a house. And over time, you may not want to stick to the exact same blueprint. You may want to move things around and be organic and change things. Maybe you want to turn one room into a different room, but you want to have a concept of what that vision looks like and what the different functional areas are and how they relate to one another, at least as a snapshot that you can revisit over time, and because it greatly informs what the design of your programs are. And it also, as another point of reference, is that it helps you articulate the value, it helps you articulate the value proposition, the very unique, specific value proposition of each of the offerings on your framework. And that's very, very important, because once you start having a portfolio of any kind, there is a great tendency for, number one, confusion. Number two, for it to cannibalize other aspects of your other offerings. And so one of the solutions is to be able to articulate very, very unique value propositions, very specific audiences, very crisp and cleanly what each is attempting to do and how they differ from one another. So On that point, on the point of not confusing the marketplace, another recommendation is not to roll all the offerings out at once if they're new. Put them out in phases and figure out which one goes first. To figure out which one goes first, you can always ask the question of, is this a strategic need? Is it market driven where there's a demand need? Those are some good questions. So you're very intentional about which programs you roll out first and why. In other cases, you may have some programs that are prerequisites for other programs. For instance, you may have an educational prerequisite. You may have an area, for instance, that is new and most of the industry doesn't understand what it really is. Perhaps having, in this case, you may not want to offer it as a prerequisite, but you may want to introduce an educational program first that educates people on what this thing is before you then test them. So the concept here is educate before you validate. So these are kinds of considerations that should be given. There's certainly other rules of thumb and questions that you should ask when you're trying to roll out a program and figure out which one goes first. But, I think all in all, a lot of thought should be given up front in terms of what the structure of this looks like, why you're rolling different things out, who it's designed for, before you actually start rolling it out. And then when you do roll it out, if they're new offerings, try not to inundate the market all at once with everything, with 10 different offerings all at once, turning on the light when 10 different offerings are there. Sometimes it's more than the market can absorb. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, but these are, I think, general rules of thumb, all things being equal. It's good to sort of stagger the rollout as opposed to just rolling out everything at once. Many of us don't have the budget to roll out everything at once, so that takes care of that problem. But should you have existing set of programs, you really should think about staggering the rollout just because the market can't absorb all those changes all at once. Which brings us to our next point, which is around, I talked a lot about the word confusion. There is a lot of confusion. So if you think about having one program and then you think about having three programs, what I have learned over time is do not underestimate how quickly the marketplace can get confused about multiple options. Which one's right for them at what time? Why should they take this one versus another one? So that really emphasizes the point, number one, graphics. Have a graphic that helps visually tell the story. It's critically important, and I would also recommend building that graphic as you're designing the Stackable framework, because it also helps your design team get very clear about the differences in the differences in the credentials that you're offering. So it's not just put a graphic out there, but it's build that graphic in tandem when you're developing your framework, because it actually is it's very clarifying, and it helps your design team get very crisp about how to design and build your Stackable framework. And the second thing it does is it helps them really attune to the end user, so in other words, it can help them think outside in versus from a design perspective. It's very easy to get caught up from a design perspective in all the details and the technicalities and become very familiar with what you're working on with no regard for the consumers. And so by building a graphic at the same time you're designing this architecture, it can greatly clarify your own thinking and simplify the communication, because you can use that graphic then later in a marketing context and an educational context, and it serves a dual purpose there. So use of graphics, start the development of the graphics early is a key recommendation. Definitely have an entire framework that you develop, have that up front, articulate the offerings and differentiate the offerings and know exactly the specific market and the specific differences and value proposition for each on a relative basis. I would also say again, the more options you offer the marketplace, they almost become exponentially confused as opposed to just from a linear perspective, from a multiplying perspective. So graphics, having a clean story, crisp examples of what is appropriate for which audience at when in their career, how it differs from others, is just absolutely essential in order for the success of of a framework like this, because at the end of the day, it's really designed for, to help your audience. It's to help your audience along a career path. But if it's not simple and it's not something that they can engage in easily and see themselves and causes frustration, that's one way that they'll bounce out of there, and that you won't have a nice uptake from having a great system like this. So it can be a really great system, but if it's not implemented in a way that your audience can understand and with some guidance and advice there for them in terms of how they navigate it, then that's one area where it's a high risk of having it fail. We talked a little bit about business decisions before in terms of the Stackable framework really starts to mirror a sales funnel, which is kind of a nice thing, especially for membership organizations who are always looking to have members engage with them over time and getting away from transactions and more towards having an engaged and loyal customer base. And this is one way certainly of doing that. On a second note, pricing and naming are very big decisions. Pricing is pretty difficult to do, as many of us would attest. I think in general, the pricing and naming should be relative to the value and worth of the credential relative to one another. I would say that is a rule of thumb. There are certainly exceptions. What I have found works a little bit better is that within the certification stack, you've got one that's sort of a subset of a larger one. Definitely have a relative pricing and naming structure. Once you move towards an assessment-based certificate program, it may have its own set of pricing rules for, so in other words, I've seen programs that have an assessment-based certificate program that's much more expensive than the certification exam. That can work, but within that category, within the assessment-based certificate category, great thought should be given to within that category, making sure that your pricing and your naming relative to one another is very thoughtful. So you don't want to have two assessment-based certificate programs that are roughly the same, out of whack from their pricing and out of whack from their naming. So I hope that makes sense. I guess the bottom line here is that, give some thought to pricing and naming. Generally speaking, it should be relative to the value and the worth of the credential, specifically, especially within categories of credentials, such as certification is one category, assessment-based certificates might be another category, and so on and so forth. So on the next slide, this gives us, we're starting to wrap up at this point, but this kind of gives you some food for thought as to what the future might look like. And I give my thanks to Liberty because I believe this is a slide that she created and which I love. But if you start thinking about certification as an industry that recognizes providing that provides an independent validation of knowledge and skills, so that's what we're known for. And you think about what people want and what employers want, and all of the disruptions that we've undergone in our industry, especially in the last decade. And one of the things that we know is that candidates want a closer alignment between training and certification. Employers want easy ways to identify and verify skills. We also know that, and candidates aren't necessarily willing to sit for long exams that test bodies of knowledge that are enormous. And candidates oftentimes have a different perspective now about what constitutes a career than they did maybe even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So these very large bodies of knowledge that we're testing that take many, many months to study for, we sometimes want to think about how we're doing that and if there's a better way. And some would argue that we need to provide a lot more flexible, candidate-centered options that are appealing to new entrants and newer audiences. And so as a result, we need to expand our thinking about what our offerings might look like. And stackable credentials and putting them in cohesive frameworks like we've described here are one way of addressing that call, of answering that call. So if you want to think about it to its extreme, it would be an interesting world where we could create our own certifications, testing on skills, when candidates need, when they want, and allowing them to specialize where appropriate, sort of a very individual and a very customer-friendly credentialing process would be is sort of the ultimate goal here. And as I mentioned, Stackable is one way, and especially coupled with micro-credentials is one way to tell that story, is one way to fill that gap. So this is food for thought in terms of what your own programs might look like, programs you already have or programs you want to build, thinking in terms of with the customer and the employer, the candidate and the employer in mind. What would your program look like if you wanted to reimagine it to address the future and what we're seeing as far as the trends of what people want and what they need? Next slide.
Okay.
So I'm going to hand it back over to you, Manny. Take us home.
So these are the myths, and these myths actually come from conversations with various individuals in the industry who are in the certification or credentialing business, and we get these sort of questions. Stackable credentials, do they really need to meet measurement standards? Yes, they should, especially if they exist. They should meet measurement and psychometric and test development standards. The credentials itself are meeting the standards itself, the assessments and associated with those credentials. But there are no, quote, a stackable credential standard itself because it's just a positioning or a way of organizing your credentials to meet the needs of your segments. And it is a type of credential. Well, no, that's not true. It is not a type of credential. Again, it's a positioning marketing type strategy to meet the needs of the workforce and your credential holders. It costs a lot of money. Well, if you're starting from scratch, the certifications that would make up your stackable credentials would. If you don't have it organized in a logical manner and you need to organize it as well as create a marketing campaign, it can cost money. It doesn't have to necessarily cost a lot of money. So that's another myth. It doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. And another myth is that we hear is it does not relate to accreditation standards. Well, if the accreditation standards are against each certification or credential or certificate or any other credential that's out there. And so you could have an accredited program that has accredited certification where you have some that are accredited and some that are not. I have clients that have that within the Stackable framework. So accreditation is by the credential itself. It's not by the Stackable credential at all, if that makes any sense. So those are some of the myths that we've heard along the way and we've addressed along the way. Again, the best way to look at that is to think of how your credentials stack from a marketing positioning point of view in terms of how each credential could be a product, and then look at it from that viewpoint. So we're going to move forward here with saying thank you to all of you. Jen and I are very thankful for presenting this, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. We do have upcoming free webinars as part of the All Institute. And the next one, like I said, is with Bill Ellis at the Board of Pharmacy Specialists, and then Sue Orchard. And then we're going to do delivering and receiving feedback in June. We have 2 in June, and then in August we're going to look at personality profiles. And keep attuned. Go to the website aereexperts.com, and you could look at the various courses that we're going to offer, and you can register for them for free. We'll be posting this online as well. Jen, I don't know if you have any other closing comments.
No, just thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.